My part of this panel focuses on how leaders can harness diversity and inclusion to advance equity in medicine. Disclosure, I have no relationships with any entity producing, marketing, reselling, or distributing healthcare goods or services consumed by or used on patients. First and foremost, why am I here? So my journey for He to She really began with my parents. So my mother is from Iceland, which is the best country in the world to be a woman, according to the World Economic Forum. And my father is from India, and he's in fact from a rural part of India that is the farthest away from gender equity in all of India. And so I've watched my cousins grow up with very different expectations, especially my female cousins, and different opportunities in life. And so that had really bothered me to my core as I was growing up, and I didn't really know what to do about it or how to act on it until I got more involved in medicine and organized medicine and realized that I had a lot to say and contribute as someone who wanted to make an impact in policy. And so I met Julie Silver through Twitter, and I say where else because we're often on Twitter and often doing a lot to advocate for women in medicine. And so Dr. Silver and she's been really a great advocate and a mentor and sponsor for me, has given me a lot of great opportunities. And in around April of 2018, she sent me a message and said, you know what, Michael, I want to do something big. I'm just not sure what that big thing is. And so we talked about it. So my big idea for Dr. Silver was not to create model legislation for states, which was something we certainly thought about and may still consider doing, but to use the levers at my disposal as someone who had gone to the American Medical Association meetings and debated policy there for a number of years, to bring a resolution to the AMA that addressed the major issues and concerns we had about gender equity. And so this was the language of the resolution that was debated at the AMA House of Delegates in June of 2018. And we asked the AMA to disseminate a report detailing positions and recommendations for gender equity in medicine. We asked the AMA to disseminate practices and policies for physician compensation. We asked the AMA to collect and analyze comprehensive demographic data about their own organization, so representation at the House of Delegates, on reference committees, and within leadership positions for plenary speakers, recognition awards, and grant funding. And finally, we asked the AMA to do something which received a little bit of pushback at first, but was ultimately a non-issue. We asked the AMA to level the pay gap within its own organization and to routinely evaluate and level pay gaps when they were discovered. And so this passed with support from a number of colleagues at the AMA. Dr. Silver and I had a blog post ready to go when this passed because we saw the momentum moving toward passage. The AMA 1 year later issued a list of principles of gender equity. I think the biggest take home here are not the details, but the fact that they came out and made a list of principles and also asked state medical societies and other specialty medical societies to follow along and adopt these same principles. AMWA came to me and Dr. Silver soon thereafter and wanted to do something related to our gender equity resolution, wanted to see how we could get more momentum across state medical societies. And so we formed the Revolution by Resolution initiative within AMWA. And the goal here is to take the same language that the AMA passed and to get that language passed across all 50 state medical societies. And you'll see members of the steering committee here, including Dr. Eliza Chin and Dr. Roberta Gebhard, Dr. Kimberly Seidel Miller, Dr. Silver and I, and Dr. Meredith Englander. In green, these are states that have passed gender equity resolutions. Yellow are states where they are actively being debated, and blue are states where AMWA members are behind the scenes preparing and drafting resolutions to be put forward at their state medical societies. So I think the biggest concern when we talk about diversity and inclusion is the idea of an echo chamber. So the notion that when we have these conversations, the people who would benefit most and potentially learn the most from conversations on diversity and inclusion are not in the room. And so in terms of gender equity, I co-present a talk with Dr. Stephanie Mueller, who is a hospitalist at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. And it's based on a top 10 list that I created in October of 2018, 10 ways for men to support women in medicine. And this is a whole separate talk I give, but I'd like to highlight some of the more important examples from that list and broaden it to diversity and inclusion. So the first is to listen and learn from diverse experiences. And this was the gender example. So this was in the New Yorker, a proposal that men listen to women for 5 seconds before opting to skip ahead to content featuring other men, themselves, or animals. And in fact, if after 5 seconds the woman has failed to make an impression, a skip woman button would be available to make this process smoother, just like YouTube. Now, this is not what we should do in terms of listening, but as leaders, I think it's extremely important to listen and learn from diverse experiences. This may mean hosting listening sessions, and not just one session, but multiple sessions. Initiating dialogue with thoughtful and open-ended questions, making sure that you pre-screen those questions for evidence of bias or assumptions. You want to be as forthcoming and transparent as possible. Using active listening skills, so not talking over or interrupting, and not trying to correct the narrative if you're hearing something that may feel unsettling at first. This requires you to turn off those natural defense mechanisms and really take that information back with you. Take the time to reflect on what you've heard and change behavior if warranted, because if employees see the culture change from the top, they're going to be much more likely to engage and be open to communicate. Appreciating differences in communication, and again, this comes from having listening sessions and understanding styles of communication, but recognizing that communication is perceived differently. And so this was again based on gender differences in communication, female gender role based on the stereotype that women are nice, kind, and compassionate. But in contrast, in a leadership role, one is expected to take charge, demonstrate toughness, and be assertive. And so this produces what is known in the literature as the double bind, that women are either too shrill or too sweet, and there is no in between. It's also important to note that there are racial and ethnic differences in communication that we need to pay attention to. So linguistic profiling is just one example of this. The notion is that many Americans can guess a caller's ethnic background from their first hello on the telephone. And of course, this is not limited to the US, but the principles still apply. This is an excerpt from the case of California versus O.J. Simpson. This is an attorney interrogating someone on the stand, and the attorney says, "The second voice that you heard sounded like the voice of a black man. Is that correct?" And this same attorney later, interviewing somebody, asked, "When you heard that voice, you thought it was of the voice of a young white male, didn't you?" Another study done in 2003, are Emily and Greg more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal? A field experiment on labor market discrimination. So they conducted a study and found that job applicants with white names needed to send about 10 resumes to get one callback, but those with African American names needed to send around 15 resumes to get one callback. And these are people with identical resumes and different names. And the authors noted that a white name yields as many more callbacks as an additional 8 years of experience. This was recently highlighted by the Harvard Business School in an article titled "Minorities Who Whiten Job Resumes Get More Interviews." So how do leaders respond to this? Recognizing differences and how we may perceive them involves overcoming unconscious bias. And so there is the implicit association test. There are a number of these that are hosted on Harvard's webpage. They're fascinating tests. I've taken several. And they give you a sense of if you have any implicit biases toward various people or race, gender, obesity, disability, etc. There are a number of courses. This is just one on the edX platform on unconscious bias. There are famous lectures, the employees session that Google hosts that is available on their webpage as well. I'd like to shift and talk a little bit about safety. So I think it's incredibly important to think about safety in the workplace. Worker safety is paramount. And this is just one example. So frontline healthcare workers, Dr. Esther Chu asked them to share a pic of the personal protection equipment they need to stay safe during the COVID-19 epidemic that is currently affecting our country and led to the cancellation of this in-person conference for AMWA. Also, Time's Up Healthcare, which was founded about a year ago by 50 women in healthcare committed to preventing sexual harassment and gender inequity and protecting and aiding those who are targets of discrimination and harassment. They opened and launched their organization with a profound video of he for she allies talking about speaking up when discrimination and harassment occurs. The other important thing to think about is psychological safety. So this is not the same as physical safety, but this really matters for safety in the long run. And so psychological safety, as defined by Professor Amy Edmondson of Harvard Business School, is when you create conditions in which listening and speaking up is the norm. And so Professor Edmondson notes in those settings that it is far less likely that employees will refrain from sharing valuable information, insights, or questions. And it is far more likely that leaders will listen to rather than dismiss bad news or early warnings. Now, this, of course, is very important for business, but it's also extremely important for healthcare settings as well. And these are some of the other topics that she touches on. I chose a few here to highlight: extreme candor, productive conflict, humble listening and asking for input, making it safe to fail, which I think is incredibly important, and speaking up for workers' safety, as Dr. Chu and several other physicians are doing right now with regard to PPE in COVID-19. Equal pay, I think, is a critically important aspect for diversity and inclusion. It's pay gaps across gender and race and ethnicity are apparent in medicine, and so it's really important to be able to say that you are paying people equally for their work. Here, for example, are the pay gaps between women in purple and men in turquoise. And so you see disparities across all races, but you also see widening of disparities across certain races, African Americans, Hispanic, and Latino physicians. So I think it's really important to encourage physicians, and other healthcare employees to share salary negotiation strategies. And one of my colleagues pointed out on Twitter that she consulted a local lawyer and that it is often a breach of contract to share compensation info. And so technically that is true if there is a term in the contract that says do not share this information with anybody. You have breached the contract because you have violated a term that you have both signed in writing. But I argue that it's really unenforceable. The reason it's unenforceable is because it essentially perpetuates pay inequities. Why would you have a contract or a provision in your contract that says you are not allowed to discuss this unless you are paying people unequally and you don't want them to find out? And so what I tell to people and leaders who are in a position to hire, it's important not to require negotiation for equal pay, so offer the same initial salary and benefits package to all new hires. Certainly don't make something non-negotiable for some but engage others in negotiations. Routinely review salaries and adjust when pay inequities are discovered, and I note that they absolutely will be discovered, especially as you increase the size of your organization. So salary audits are critical here. This is what we ask the AMA to do. This is what I implore all leaders to do for healthcare organizations. Create an external and transparent process. I think transparency is incredibly important here. Audit across multiple dimensions, so not just gender, but age, race, ethnicity, other dimensions. Conduct these audits frequently. And I tell people all the time, if the AMA has leveled its pay gap, so can your organization. And saying no to the old boys club. This is a panel of men discussing the tampon tax. This is an all-male panel, or a manel of men at a global summit of women. You'll see highlighted in red there. I hope the woman at the bottom of the picture is taking a picture of these gentlemen to post on Twitter and shame them for being an all-male panel. Here's one of my favorite all-male panels, a panel for women in math, for all women who love math, starring 4 men. A panel of 6 men. ENT was better in my day. I wonder what they're going to say about ENT that was better. Perhaps the old boys club. My contribution to the manel discussion on Twitter. How to spot a manel, the machine learning AI edition. Manels can easily be identified by the often conspicuous row of colorful parallel lines emerging from the neck region of the photograph subjects, unimpeded by noise from diversity and inclusion. There's an organization known as Gender Avenger. They ask men to take a pledge that they will not serve as a panelist at a public conference when there are no women on the panel. And there's another organization known as Manel Watch US. They also talk about WANELs, or all white panels, and so I've taken a pledge not to serve on a panel when there are all white people or all males, although my being half Indian means that any panel I am on is by definition not a WANEL. Finally, 10 simple rules to achieve conference speaker gender balance, but I think these are rules to live by that are more broadly applicable to diversity and inclusion across all aspects of healthcare. Collecting data. Data is important. Data is paramount to any decision that's being made. Developing a speaker policy, or developing a policy in general. Making sure that policy is visible. So again, this is transparency. If you are planning a conference, having a balanced and informed program committee, but this also applies to any type of committee or subcommittee you develop. Make sure that they're balanced and informed. Make sure that they are diverse and reflect the populations that they aim to serve. Reporting that data. So not only collecting your internal data, but reporting it out and making it publicly visible. Responding to resistance. This sometimes means acknowledging mistakes. And in terms of conferences, supporting women at meetings and being family friendly. And so the way I like to think of this is if you're planning a conference, it's not just about supporting women, it's about supporting families at conferences. And the AMA, for instance, has what is known as Camp AMA. And so families with children will, in fact, bring their children to the conference. And the kids go to Camp AMA or daycare during the meeting. And finally, number 10 is to take the gender offender pledge that I already mentioned. So with that, I welcome questions, comments, and look forward to a lively discussion on Saturday. Thank you.